All right, kids, we're back on Play It Forward with Caroline Golum and your film, a very interesting, unique, fascinating topic, certainly, is the 16 showings of Julian of Norwich. Um, so thank you for being on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself or set up the short film in any way?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Caroline Golum. I am a filmmaker, film programmer, and writer based in New York City, by way of Los Angeles. I've been here for about half my life. And Julian of Norwich is a real person. She's like an actual historical figure. She's considered the earliest known woman to write a book in English, which is, kind of a shock, like considering that she's still relatively obscure unless you're like a medievalist or somebody who studies women mystics. I think within these more like niche or esoteric circles, she's pretty well known for her writing, for her spiritual practice. The work that she did was very profound. But to a broader audience, when they're thinking like, oh, who's the first woman to write a book in English? They're like, I don't know, Emily Dickinson, George Sand, but she wrote her text that this film is based on sometime in like the late 14th century, maybe even the
Wow.
early 15th. So if you're thinking about, medieval England at this time, it's a time that's not unlike our own. There's a lot of social upheaval, a lot of political upheaval, push and pull between church and state. There's an emerging kind of like proto middle class of people who are merchants or people who sell things or make things and sell them at market, known as burghers, that are concentrating in big cities. The German word "burg" means city, so that's where we get burger.
Mm.
So Julian is working in Norwich at this time. It's probably like the second or third biggest city in England. So she's in like a major city with a lot of different kinds of people moving in and out of it. It's a port city. So, we know historically that sites of trade are also places where people from different cultures and countries come to meet. And what makes her story so special is, she wrote in the third person, which was the custom at the time. But her book, first there was like a short text, and then she expanded it into a longer text, and we'll get into that in a second. Is her account of 3 days of fantastic religious visions that she had while she was dying of a mysterious illness. And it's a very rare, autobiographical work from a woman at this time. She describes herself in the third person, not using gendered language necessarily, but like, describes herself as a simple creature, unlettered. She cites the date that this happened to her. She says on the 13th day of May, 1373. She describes being on the precipice of death and receiving her last rites from her confessor. And the scene that kind of opens this text is very cinematic. She talks about laying in bed, like her vision is getting blurry, like she can't feel her body from the waist down. I mean, just really visceral stuff. And she describes a curate, a holy person, holding a crucifix in front of her, like, to give her the last rites. And she describes looking at this crucifix and then watching it transform in real time into the living, breathing body of Jesus Christ on the cross, like a dissolve, right? Dissolving from the inanimate to the visceral. It's crazy. And then it just gets weirder from there, right? So she had a series of 16 visions. She calls them showings, because they were shown to her by
And
ostensibly.
she's, pardon interruption, she is, and we, well, is fascinating material, fascinating subject. She is a nun or someone of that persuasion
Oh,
living in a nunnery or a convent.
that's
No.
what makes her so special, is that she's probably, I mean, there's a lot we don't know about her. Like, this is really kind of one of the few primary source documents we have about Julian, but they suspect that she probably wasn't a nun. And the reason for this is because after she had these visions, she voluntarily had herself walled into a cell attached to like her local church. And she became what is called an anchorite or an anchoress. So like a holy hermit. And if she had been a nun living in a convent or a community, then she would have been walled into a cell at that
Okay.
or at that church. But this is her local church, which I went to last summer for my research. She, that church is just like a regular little local church. And if you think about like how populous churches were in cities like Norwich at the time, you estimate it's like one church for every 100 people. It's kind of like a corner deli. Like every little
Got
block
it.
have a church of different sizes. People went to church multiple times a day. The pervasiveness of the Catholic Church in Europe at this time, I mean, the only thing I can compare it to is like the internet, right? It's a thing that's around us all the time. There's specific places that you go to access it, like a library or whatever, but you're always thinking about it. You always carry some part of it with you, whether it's like a little totem or a devotional thing. So she was a regular person.
Got it. And she must have been educated somehow. So was she from the upper class?
Well, probably, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
if she could read and write, the odds are good that she was probably educated at a convent, but
I
didn't
see.
necessarily take a vow. And this was also,
Fascinating.
when I said earlier, you get this like emerging middle class of burghers, merchants, people who aren't nobility, but they're not peasants. They're kind of in the middle. The fashionable thing to do in the late 14th century, if you had a daughter, was to send her to a convent to be educated. And
Oh,
this
I see.
was
Interesting.
a marriage prospect. The
So,
irony being that she's educated and then she decides not to get married at all.
Carolyn, I mean, I could literally like just sit down and like, chill out, lay down and listen to you talk for a while because it's very, very fascinating stuff. And pull out the there you go, e-pen cigarette.
Oh yeah,
Um,
tool relentlessly. This is the secret to my success.
I see. So, that said, the questions that I have for you today, I'm going to get in there. And the first one is, what is it about you that connects with this topic? And what excited you to say, hey, I'm going to do this about this woman who has these visions and happens to have written the first book?
So I didn't know a lot about the Middle Ages before this story kind of came across the transom, but the story behind it is related to my practice. So the first film, the first feature that I directed, it's called The Feast of Man. It came out in like 2017. And I finished shooting it in I want to say like 2014, 2015, and then it was like years of post because I made this movie with like nothing. We Airbnb'd the location. I got a loan from my bank. I used paid time off for my job. Like the budget for this movie was like 20 grand. And the post took years because I was paying for post in installments. Like people would work for a little bit, I'd pay them, I'd go back to work, they'd work a little bit, I'd pay them, etc. It's very hard. When the film was finished sometime in the spring of 2017, I hadn't yet received any kind of like festival acceptance. I'd been rejected a bunch, but I hadn't gotten the film in anywhere. And so I was looking at this thing that I devoted years of my life to, and I was thinking, oh my God, no one wants to see this fucking movie. And then compounding this was I was working a job I hated, and Donald Trump had just been elected president. And I just thought to myself, the world sucks, and I'm ready to clock out. I'm done. Right. So I was lounging around in my apartment, like feeling sorry for myself. And my then roommate, who also acted in my first film, he's currently doing a PhD in medieval history at Hopkins, but he was getting his master's in medieval history at Columbia. His name is Lawrence Bond, and he's a great talent and a great scholar. He had just finished writing a paper about Julian, and he came downstairs. And he said, "Hey, can I read you this paper?" And I was like, "Sure, fine." And he read me this paper and told me about this woman. And I just thought, oh my God, like this would make a phenomenal film. So at a moment when I was at my absolute nadir emotionally and financially and psychologically and creatively, this thing hit me like a ton of bricks. And I just thought, wow, this is my next movie. That's it. I
Okay,
have
but
to be that.
what, why the, this mystical experience of this person? And was it related, you said to your practice, was it related to, I'm not sure what you meant by practice.
I was really moved. I mean, it was related in some way to my artistic practice for sure, right? Like the fact that this woman was moved by something incredibly profound and decided to make work about it all those centuries ago in a time when we didn't really expect much of women other than getting married and having kids. I was really moved by that. But moreover, what Julian writes about, like the content of her showings, the message that she receives from the divine realm, is an overarching message of love, right? Like everything will be okay. Love is the reason we exist. It's this awesome, inexhaustible, powerful, universal force. She understands this through the kind of lens of Christianity because that's how she was raised and that's what the world was for her. I'm not, a Christian person, like as we've established. I'm just a nice Jewish girl from the Valley who is like fascinated by Gentiles and their stranglehold on history. The church is very powerful and I'm fascinated by it. But within this very patriarchal and colonial and capitalistic institution that is the medieval Catholic Church, or the Western Church, she found or received this message of love that cuts through all the bureaucratic bullshit, all the institutional bullshit. It's just her talking to Christ about how love is the answer, and it blew me away. because I was thinking about this, like I said, the election had happened somewhat recently. The world has really only gotten worse in the ensuing years since I started working on this film. And we're obviously going to get into that in a minute too. But I was moved by this because I do agree that love is an awesome and powerful force. It's an inexhaustible resource. There is an unlimited supply of it. The only limit to its supply is what we can feel for other people, for our friends, for our communities, for the world at large. And I was like I said, I was just moved. And I thought about how fascinating the story is, how unusual, how I'd never heard anything like it. And I thought it would just make a great movie. And now
Well,
here I am all these years later.
well, that's awesome. I mean, that's, very profound and very deep and moving. And I think, one of the most interesting things that you said is that, this overwhelming, powerful resource that is only limited by our ability to connect or channel it. And, that kind of leads us into the second question, where I try to hide or couch or position this question so it's not threatening to artists, as artists who are wanting their audiences to interpret their own works for themselves. But so I say it in this way: for you as an audience member, what do you see the message of um, the short and the movie that you're making?
This this short film that we're focusing on specifically was something that I made season one of the pandemic, because I felt like my familiarity with Julian's work had kind of equipped me in an inadvertent way to deal with what was going on. And I was already working on a film about a woman who has to self-isolate and like bears witness to a plague and an uprising. Like it just shook out that way. And in the months following the first like lockdown here in New York, there was a lot of writing about obviously the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, but about Julian too. Like there was a revived interest in her work. And I thought it was really interesting that there were people who were coming to her story and looking at her work and going, okay, there's something there. And I was trying to make my feature about Julian when the pandemic broke out, and was staring down, much like before, another like world-class catastrophe, an absolute nadir of my own mental stability, and just thinking like, what do I have to do? I have to get back to work. And Julian wrote this like short text about her visions that's just like an index of like, here's what happened, very brief. And then she spent the rest of her life expanding on it, going into like a deeper philosophical exegesis. And I thought, well, Julian has a short text and she has a long text. And I can make a work about her that will keep me connected to this project, that will keep me connected to the subject, but won't necessarily take the place of it. This was my fear, was that if I start to work on a short film about Julian, then it's just going to it's going to scratch the itch and I'm going to give up. And that's not what happened. It actually like helped me, think about the larger project in a more artful way. So
That's
this was like something I had to do by myself
I
because
get
I couldn't
it.
work with anybody.
And that's very practical, pragmatic kind of rationale for doing it and evolving and continuing to let this, creative influence, kind of evolve in you and work through you, and then, build it up and not just like sit on it and do nothing. But so I guess maybe if we could kind of take the question and say, well, what's the message of Julian's work? And perhaps we already touched upon it in terms of like, hey, if there's love is ubiquitous and we're just kind of like blinded, and we need to have this near death experience to really open up to it. And here we are. How do we, as humans, she must, through her work, what does she offer? Does she offer us an opportunity to open up? What is it through her work that we can take away and live?
Hmm. I think what makes Julian such a powerful figure and what makes her story so attractive to people is that she is kind of like a tabula rasa, right? There's so many points of entry into her work and so many ways to interpret it. There's obviously like the spiritual aspect of it, right? The idea of love being the connective tissue that holds all of us together and the solution to a lot of our problems. But there's also her story as an artist working under very adverse circumstances. And her experience on her deathbed, receiving these showings from like some divine entity, whether you think she was just hallucinating or whether you think there was something there, it's almost immaterial, right? She has a profound experience And she is moved by this experience to make something that she can share with other people. The weird, ironic part of this is that in order to do that, she has to be completely isolated too, right? So I think at the crux of her story, setting aside the spiritual components, is this deeper question about what it is to be an artist. What do we owe ourselves? What do we owe ourselves as artists who must nourish our souls by making this work? But also, what do we owe other people with the work that we show them?
Hmm.
And for Julian, like, she's walled into this little cell, but like from a purely practical standpoint, it's not like she's by herself all the time. People come to see her. This is well documented for anchorites living in England at this time. You would live in this little room, but people come to see you all the time. So it's not like she's in solitary confinement. She's just constrained. She's stuck in one place. But she also has a duty to perform as a spiritual figure, right? So even though there's a part of her that wants to retreat into this visionary state, wants to retreat into this world of pure love and pure creation, there's still the very real material facets of life that seep through the cracks that she has to address. And as artists, this is like our eternal juggling act, right? And it can be as simple as, do I stay home and work on my script, or do I go to this party and network with people? Or it can be as profound as, is this gratifying to me? Like, is it enough to sustain me versus like, can I show this to people without being embarrassed? It's hard to make work for public consumption too, right? In many ways, it's like it's like having a kid. You gestate this thing, right? You grow this thing within you. You give birth to it, right? It comes out of you, and then suddenly it has to stand on its own 2 feet and be a part of the world of its own accord. And this was Julian's struggle, right? She had this deeply personal experience. It gestated within her. She made this work, but she wrote the book in English because it's not for people who are in the clergy. It's for regular people who know English. So she obviously did it for public consumption.
Right.
And this is
Yeah.
the struggle.
Well, it's a cool juxtaposition between this idea of being a saint and having a saintly experience or divine experience that has, put her in the realm of a saint, where she's walled off from society, but yet, people are, in a Hindu context, she would be offering them darshan. And that's just, seeing her and experiencing some sort of blessing through her. So how you're kind of juxtaposing that with the artist and the work of an artist, whether that's isolating and then coming out back into humanity and creating that balance. It's certainly there's something there that is similar to, having these divine inspiration and then bringing that to share, ideally through love, in a context with, audiences that can be elevated as well. Caroline, last question, play it forward. How have you been changed since making this film?
This film, getting back to what I just said about, you make something that's deeply personal and then you've got to unleash it on the world, and it has to stand on its own 2 feet. It was, the impetus for making this short film really was like, I can't sleep, I need to make work. And I had this very personal attachment to Julian's story. So I made this very personal film on a very intimate scale. I made it in this room. Like, you can't really tell, but I set up like the little tableaus and everything like right behind me and just shot them. And when I was finished with it, I looked at it and I thought, this is really beautiful. Like, this isn't just an exercise. Like, this is something that I want to share with people. And I managed to like finagle, a virtual premiere for it in 2021 for the first iteration of the Prismatic Ground Festival, which has since gone on to become like, one of the more prominent festivals of experimental documentary work here in New York. And so in so doing, I got to meet one of my dear friends, Ine, who ended up playing a small part in the feature. I got to share it with other people. I've been talking to people about it. It got written about, you know what I mean? So I had something that I had to get out of me, and I shared it with people. I took the risk and it resonated with them. And, for me, like, as a filmmaker, like, it doesn't matter what context people are watching this work, really, especially if they can't go to the movie theater to watch it. But like, the fact that it resonated with people, that it found an audience, under these adverse circumstances, just sort of confirmed to me like all of my suspicions, right? Which is that if you really want it, if you really want to make something, if you put your whole heart and soul into it, it will find the audience that it deserves, really. And it doesn't matter what size that audience is. I'd rather have 10 people watch this movie who feel it really deeply and understand it on a profound level than have it just make some sort of weird, like, you know, national festival rounds in a shorts block where people are like, what is this shit? You know what I mean? So having the right container is really important. And like, you know, I've since also been able to apply some of the kind of visual motifs that I worked out in this short film to the feature that we're working on.
Awesome. Caroline Golum, thank you for being on Play It Forward. Quality over quantity.
Yeah, that's the message. It doesn't matter if one person sees your movie, but it inspires them to make another movie, then like you've done your job.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Till next time, I'll Play It Forward. Peace.